All right. Welcome back to the Precision Protocol series brought to you by Biocanic. In this series, we nerd out on the world of personalized health, functional medicine, clinical research, and cutting edge wellness strategies. We explore the advanced science, clinical applications, and the real world impact of precision protocols designed to optimize client outcomes. As always, want to welcome my co-host here, Brendan Vermeyer. But today we're going to be deep diving into the vagus nerve. So be sure to subscribe wherever you're watching or listening and never miss an episode. And for those of you joining us live, we'll move into Q&A, but feel free to post your questions wherever you're watching. But I'm really excited to introduce the world-renowned best-selling author of Upgrade Your Vagus Nerve, Dr. Navaz Habib. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. Definitely did not expect that, but I appreciate it.
Well deserved.
Awesome. All right. I think it'd be good for just to hear a little bit of backstory about you, from your clinical how you work with clients, but then more importantly, how did you really become an expert in the vagus nerve, and where did that come from, and what inspired you to be in the space?
Yeah, great question. By profession, I'm a chiropractor. I always kind of knew through high school that I wanted to be working with people one-on-one. I wanted to be affecting their health in a positive way. And I went and spoke to a lot of my friends, medical doctors, physiotherapists, chiropractors, functional practitioners. Just at the beginning, didn't really understand what functional was at that time. And chiropractic just seemed like it fit. And I was always really hands and physical oriented. I was really interested in making the body physically work better. And what I learned and what I understood, and where my nerdiness really came out, was the brain connecting to the body, and why and how the brain connection to the body was so unique and so important. And really the two can't be separated from one another. They have to be intertwined. They're inextricably linked. And so what brought me into this whole space was I was working as a chiropractor, was having my own health struggles. And that was really kind of the starting point, trying to figure out these issues for myself, what was causing these issues. So I was well overweight, significantly dealing with like blood sugar issues, high blood pressure. I was borderline diabetic. A lot of these things that nobody should be dealing with, I was dealing with in my early 20s. And that led me into kind of a space where I was trying to figure out what to do with my health, how to optimize that, how to get that better. And I wasn't comfortable with the answers that I was getting from my medical doctors, which was start running and count calories. And that was kind of the extent of what I was recommended, outside of the, you should probably get on blood pressure meds, and we need to do something about your blood sugar. And that was it, medication wise. Never felt like it was enough. I was introduced to a wonderful friend and mentor, Sachin Patel, in a very chance encounter. I'm sure we don't have time for the full story, but he kind of just walked into a clinic that I was working in, and turns out he lived upstairs. And he introduced me to functional medicine. And that was really the initial point where I was introduced to understanding what health truly meant, creating real health. And this was where my real interest in understanding inflammation and how the body controls inflammation through the vagus nerve really began. So I started working with clients through the Living Proof Institute, working with Sachin, learning from him. And this was really unique and really important in that journey. What eventually came of it was I realized through all of these chronic health conditions that I was helping these clients try to overcome, there was a missing piece in a lot of these journeys, and that was stress was triggering inflammation, and they didn't have the nervous system capabilities to regulate their inflammation that was currently chronic in their states. This was anybody dealing with IBS, IBD, to autoimmune conditions, to metabolic dysfunction. It was across the board that there was just this uncontrolled inflammation, and the vagus nerve is this link to control inflammation. And that was really my nerdiness that brought me in to figure this out, because it was around this time that in the research, we were just learning about the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway. That's where the vagus nerve became my bread and butter. I became really, really interested in that and started supporting that in my clients. And then I decided to write a book, and the rest is where we are right now. So I'm here with you guys because I learned all about why the vagus nerve is so important in optimizing this inflammatory control piece for so many people.
Yeah. And I think, we've talked quite a bit, and Brendan, I'd love to jump in as well as kind of how that kind of fits into your thinking. But, we've talked about kind of testing, neuroinflammation testing, gut testing, hormone testing, anything, food sensitivity, everything. But, you kind of talk about this as kind of like the missing link. So, when you think about kind of a traditional approach, it's very much test, don't guess, but we're going to get a whole bunch of metabolic markers, but can't really do that in this case. So how do you think about it from a practical application level, Brendan, how you think about it as well with working with your clients?
So from my perspective, the nervous system and this particular vagus nerve piece was missed by a lot of the practitioners because they were just focused on the test results, and the result dictated the therapy. And I appreciate where that comes from, because I came from the same mindset, right? Like, do a functional mechanical test, like a Kemp's test, for example, and likely it's a facet dysfunction in the neck. And so you want to find that spot and adjust it, and all clear. Mm-hmm. The real question that's being missed is, why is that happening in the first place? And we really want to know that function is optimal, that allows the nutrients to get in, the mitochondria to do the work. And when the mitochondria is capable of doing its good work, then we're going to be able to regulate inflammation and have optimal cellular function based on the genetics that each cell has. Now, where that missing link came in for me is there is a feeling that is required to ensure that we get the signals to every cell in the body to make them function optimally. Mm-hmm. And that signal is one of regulation, one of entering a state where you're capable of healing. Mm-hmm. And that is this state of safety. Safety is the feeling that turns on the vagus nerve. Now, safety, we can often just put into this psychology bucket. And yes, that's a very, very important piece. So people who have had some sort of psychological trauma, adverse childhood event, Brendan, I know your story. I know this is like a huge piece to what happened in your case and those around you. But the safety piece from a psychology standpoint is something that a lot of biochemical focused practitioners forget about. But biochemical safety is something that a lot of the psychological practitioners forget about. And physical safety is something that a lot of the medical doctors that are doing online calls forget about. And we want to really look at all of these aspects: psychology, physical, biochemical, and emotional day-to-day safety. And if you're not feeling safe in any of those realms, the level of stress that you're under is going to push you into a sympathetic fight or flight state. And so what that does is it turns off the parasympathetic side, which is that vagus nerve activated side. And it decreases the function of the vagus nerve, or the capability of the vagus nerve, when that stress or that lack of safety is something that's happening chronically, long-term. And then let's say this person, for example, had some sort of psychological trauma when they were younger. Then they added in some sort of, biochemical lack of safety because they were exposed to excess toxins, or they lacked good nutrients. And then their physical environment just wasn't optimal as well. What we're doing is we're pouring in more and more stressors into that bucket, pushing that person into that sympathetic state. It's like they have a brick sitting on their gas pedal, and the brakes just are incapable of shutting it down because they're burnt out. The brake pads are burnt out. The brake fluid is low. All of that. The braking system of the body is not functioning well. So for me, that is that missing link, because really safety is that feeling that needs to be initiated in order for the body to shift from sympathetic to parasympathetic, because we can only heal in a parasympathetic state. We cannot heal when our bodies are stuck in a sympathetic fight or flight state all the time.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I think it's a pretty powerful explanation. And Navaz, you and I have always had so much synergy with our work, because I focus a lot on the glial system, the immune system of the brain, and then everything that impacts it, right? And so with the gut-brain axis kind of being arguably biggest hub that's going to impact, the immune system of the brain. And well, gosh, that vagus nerve is one of the primary pathways that helps facilitate that bidirectional communication. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's like 80% of the signaling is from the body to the brain afferently.
That's right.
Vagus nerve, right?
Yeah, for the vagus nerve, it's 80% afferent and 15% efferent, brain down. And then there's 4% motor and 1% sensory from the ear. But you're right, 80% is coming from the organs up to the brain through the vagus nerve.
So riddle me this, because I love the way that you're describing, the concept of allostasis, right? That balance of sympathetic tone, parasympathetic tone, and I think for the audience, it's helpful to think of this as like a sliding scale or like a light switch of which way is it leaning? Is it leaning towards the fight or flight and the cortisol and norepinephrine? Is it leaning towards more of a parasympathetic kind of rest and digest, feed and breed type of state? And your nervous system is always trying to regulate itself. And
that's exactly right.
My friend Nicole LaPera, she took the concepts of HP axis dysfunction and allostasis and just gave it more simplistic language that is nervous system regulation, which now has proliferated like every aspect of the space, right? But I think it's kind of more trendy, simplified verbiage because it empowers people of like, how do I regulate my nervous system? Why do I feel triggered or destabilized or unsettled? But what I'm really curious here, because when I first, stumbled across the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway in the literature, I mean, it blew my mind. And so I'm kind of curious to hear you mentioned it briefly. And I think that mechanism in sort of like, how does this allostatic flux impact this cholinergic pathway that seems to kind of regulate a lot of inflammatory processes? I'm sort of questioning how centralized that pathway, regulated by the tone of the vagus nerve and, the implications for, we're in a chronic disease epidemic. So if we have this massive nerve that so profoundly regulates the inflammatory cascade, I mean, that seems pretty important, especially when you think about, was it like 2005? I think vagus nerve stimulators were approved for treatment-resistant depression by the FDA or something like that.
Yeah, you're right. It was around 2005, 2006 where it started for epilepsy, and those were the implanted devices. And then treatment-resistant depression came very soon after that. But you're exactly right. So let's talk about this system, the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway or reflex. Mm-hmm. So what this is it's the body's innate regulatory pathway that runs through the parasympathetic system primarily. And it's regulated through the vagus nerve being kind of the linchpin to this entire system. So if we think of the vagus nerve as being the connecting piece between the immune cells and the brain, I think that is the best way to understand how this whole system works. So the immune cells that are located in every single organ of the body, these are the tissue resident macrophages. So in the gut, we've got 60, 70% of the immune system by volume cells are located in the lining of the gut. Those cells are communicating up to the brain as to what's happening within the gut. And you're absolutely right, gut-brain axis is key to all of this because that's where all of the good stuff and most of the bad stuff comes in as well. We're sending that information from these immune cells as to what's happening within the microbiome, what's happening with inflammation in the gut, what's happening with gut function, gut motility, etc. All of that information is being sent up to the brain through the vagus nerve. We're also getting this information from the liver. The Kupffer cells are the tissue-resident macrophage of the liver. So what's the toxic load? What's the toxic burden within the body? And what's the liver saying in terms of what's going on there? That information's getting up. It's coming from the pancreas. It's coming from the Langerhans cells in the skin. It's coming from alveolar macrophages in the lungs. Every organ has these tissue-resident macrophages in them, and they're communicating directly to the brain, specifically via the vagus nerve, into the nucleus tractus solitarius in the brainstem. That's kind of where all of the parasympathetic afferent information comes in, and then it goes up into the central nervous system, where your area of expertise, Brendan, is the glial cells, microglial cells. So microglial cells in the brain are the tissue-resident macrophage of the brain. Communication has to be optimal between these two. Now, when we lack a feeling of safety, that communication is hindered. When we lack that overall feeling of calm, of relaxation, of feeling safe, vagus nerve is not able to send that information effectively. What that means is then the brain, in its central executive function areas and in its, primitive brain areas that are where a lot of these decisions are made, are not getting the information that they need. They're not getting good information as to what's happening above, what's happening below. And that information is where I like to say kind of the brain is the CEO of the body. And if the CEO of the body is not able to get information from the marketing team, from the sales team, from the HR team, from, all of the specific people that are part of that team, if we're not able to have good communication, the CEO isn't going to be able to make a great decision. So the way that then this system breaks down is the CEO says, well, I don't have great information, but based on what I have, I think we're under threat and we need to shut down this vagus nerve system a little bit and allow there to be more sympathetic tone turned on. We need to ensure, because I don't know what's going on, I think there may be a threat. And because I think there could be a threat, we need to be in this sympathetic state so we can fight anything that might be coming in. And so there's signals sent out through norepinephrine, primarily through the sympathetic nervous system, to turn these same immune cells that were sending information up, ideally in an effective manner, into a sympathetic M1 activated state. And those M1 activated states are pro-inflammatory. And they're good. We need to have this pro-inflammatory system, but we need to have the checks and balances in place. And that comes through the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway. So when we're able to turn the vagus nerve back on, what we're able to do is start signaling with acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is the primary neurotransmitter. In fact, it's the only neurotransmitter utilized by the vagus nerve. And so when we signal acetylcholine via the vagus nerve directly from the vagus nerve efferent signals, that's that 15% of vagus nerve efferent signals that go to each of these organs, it activates the alpha-7 nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, which is then going to shut down that inflammatory pathway, or at the cellular level. So through the JAK2 STAT3 pathway and the NF-kappa B pathway, we're able to downregulate the production of inflammatory cytokines. We literally tell the cell to stop producing these inflammatory signals. In fact, at the other level, the same receptor is actually located on the outer membrane of mitochondria itself. And when acetylcholine gets into the cell, and there are certain circumstances where it would, and that circumstance is incredibly high levels of ATP extracellularly, acetylcholine can get in, attached to that same receptor, the alpha-7 nicotinic acetylcholine receptor on the surface of the mitochondria, and shuts down the mitochondrial DNA release, essentially stopping the mitophagy that can occur, the mitochondrial DNA release, which is going to kill the cell. What we're doing when we produce or when we send acetylcholine out is we're downregulating the inflammatory systems. We're getting inflammation shut down, and through nervous system regulation into a balanced parasympathetic, sympathetic, balanced state, where parasympathetic is where we want to be most of the time, we're able to send this signal of acetylcholine to those cells to downregulate. Now, what about the cells that don't have direct vagus nerve activation or a direct signal from the vagus nerve to those cells? Because it's not affecting every area directly. There's a pathway that we utilize, and that's through the spleen. So the vagus nerve has a connection to the splenic ganglion that goes to the splenic nerve, which is actually a sympathetic nerve, and that's a whole nother anatomy lesson that we could go through, but probably not for today. And that goes to the spleen, which actually tells these CD4 plus T cells that are located in the spleen to go out via the bloodstream and produce acetylcholine themselves and send out acetylcholine via the bloodstream to all of those other tissues that are present in areas where the vagus nerve is not directly connecting to. So the skin, for example, or for the bones or for the muscle, we want to get acetylcholine there. So through the bloodstream, these CD4 plus T cells that contain this very specific enzyme called choline acetyltransferase. Essentially, these cells are now called chat cells, choline acetyltransferase cells. They're then going out and releasing more acetylcholine, amplifying that acetylcholine signal. That is the reflex of cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway, that when there is inflammation, a signal is sent up through a well-functioning vagus nerve to the nucleus tractus solitarius. We then have our processing occurring in the central nervous system, which then sends an appropriate signal when it's functioning well, when the CEO is able to make a good decision, down through the vagus nerve efferents to amplify and release more acetylcholine out to downregulate inflammation. But when that system is broken down, primarily because vagus nerve dysfunctions, that's where the issue breaks down and we end up in a chronic inflammatory state. So I know I went heavy on the science there, but I hope that makes it a little more understandable as to what this system looks like and how the pathway runs through the brain and the vagus nerve specifically.
Awesome. Just getting to a couple questions that came in. And of course, if you have questions, post them in the comments wherever you're watching. The first one was, and I guess this kind of leads into a great topic, which is I wanted 65 TGFVBL want to know what thing a patient/client can do to regulate the vagus nerve that are most impactful. And I think, obviously we'll talk about a little bit about the stimulation side, but then you also have the Joe Dispenzas of the world, which is more meditation, more massive meditation, the better. And that's the only thing that'll ever fix it.
There's a lot of dogma around this. And I appreciate Joe Dispenza, and I appreciate all of the work that a lot of these people are doing. I don't think there's any specific one answer to all of it, but everything comes back to one specific thing, and that is the breath. The breath is how we regulate our nervous system. The breath is the single strongest way to determine whether you're going sympathetic or parasympathetic. And regulating the breath is key. So understanding your style of breath, the characteristics or the specifics of your breathing pattern or your patient's breathing pattern, and then making a change to that is really how we're going to be able to understand. So there's 3 things that your breath needs to be in order to shift to a parasympathetic breath rather than a sympathetic style of breath. So number 1, we should be breathing through our nose. The nose is the breathing tube. The mouth is the eating tube. We don't have teeth in our nose. We don't have nose hairs in our mouth. So the nose hairs are a filter, ensuring that the air that's coming in, any particulate matter, any debris, any dust, whatever, does not make its way into our body. They're filtered out through nose hairs. Number 2, that air goes in through the sinuses and it filters, it humidifies, it warms, and then it goes down into the lungs where gas exchange becomes far more easy because the temperature is better and it's cleaner air and it's humid. So that helps to enable more of that gas exchange to come in. So more oxygen in, more CO2 is able to then come out more effectively. If we breathe through our mouth, we're not filtering that. We're not humidifying it as effectively, and we're not warming the air as effectively as when it runs through the sinuses. So number 1, got to breathe through your nose. Number 2, we want to make sure that we're breathing with our diaphragm. Our diaphragm is a muscle that runs between the chest and the thorax, or the thorax and the abdomen, the chest and the belly. And the best way to understand what your breath is currently doing is to put one hand on your chest, one hand on your belly, and take 3 deep breaths and check to see what's happening. Am I feeling more motion on the hand on my chest or more motion on the hand that's on my belly? And as you do that, what you start to notice is, oh, maybe I'm breathing more with my chest. And I like to do this with my patients, even on a call. I'll start a call and I'll say, okay, what's going on? Oh, you seem a little amped up. Let's take a few deep breaths. And so we'll take 3 breaths and we'll go in to the chest area and we'll check to see, oh yeah, look, you're breathing more with your chest. Let's take 3 calm breaths. Let's slow it down and let's start belly breathing. This is a great thing, even with kids. So I've got 2 daughters. They're pretty young. They have their moments where tantrums and kind of dysregulation occurs. And that's a normal thing with kids. Just for those of you who don't have kids, it happens a lot. Teaching them how to breathe through those moments is really the only way to make these changes occur. So what I like to do is put a hand on their belly and say, okay, imagine that there's a balloon in your belly, and I want you to imagine what color that balloon is, and I want you to imagine what Disney character or whatever your favorite thing is on that balloon. And now I want you to, when you take a breath in, I want you to blow that balloon up in your belly. And then I want you to shrink it down. And visualization is a great way to distract the mind and allow the body to enter this state where you're just focused and your attention is internal rather than external. Because really that's where the disconnect happens for a lot of people. And so teaching even parents, kids, whoever you're working with, how to just ensure that it's a belly breath first, that's a great way to create that shift. The third characteristic, we said nasal, diaphragmatic. The last one is inhale versus exhale ratio. So how much time you're spending inhaling versus exhaling is really important here. And you don't really think about this, but this is how we create our HRV, is through the ratio of inhale to exhale. So most people actually have a slightly longer inhale than exhale, and it's usually a very short ratio. It's usually about 1.5 to 2 seconds in and 1 to 1.5 seconds out. And so our breath rate when we're awake will tend to be in the 15 to 18 up to 20 breaths per minute while we're awake and not exercising, not running around. And what that tells us is as we inhale, our heart rate slightly increases, and as we exhale, our heart rate comes down. And this is a direct correlation. And so as we inhale, what that's telling us is that we're going into a slightly more sympathetic state. So Brendan, on your analogy of the dimmer switch, and it's a dimmer switch, not an on-off switch for those who didn't catch that, you're slightly increasing the dimmer switch up when you breathe in, and then you're breathing out, you're slightly bringing it down. And it's just this slight variation that occurs with this slight up and down with each breath that dictates what your heart rate variability is. And we'll get into that in a second. But that ratio is what matters. So what we want to really do is spend time focused on longer exhales. The longer time we spend in an exhale, the more parasympathetic time we have, the more time we have turning the vagus nerve on. Then we can layer on all of these other things. So nasal, diaphragmatic, longer exhales is step one. And then we can layer in humming, chanting, gargling, singing, cold plunge. All of these things affect your breath. Meditation affects your breath. It's a breath-focused practice. Yoga, Pilates, breath-focused practices. Stimulation paired with electrical stim on the ear, on the neck, whatever you choose, paired with breathing is really the key to making this whole thing work. But at the end of it, distill it down, what's the one thing that needs to be regulated by far is just the breath.
So kind of taking this to like a tactical, practical application, we kind of through the mechanisms, and the different pathways. When we think about kind of a traditional functional health practitioner, how does one actually implement this in clinical practice relative to diet, supplements, other recommendations, programs, content, all that other stuff? Where does this fit in, and how do you put that into clinical practice?
It's a great question. So for me, I've created a bit of a protocol with the fun acronym VAGUS, VAGUS. So it's not spelt Las Vegas. It's VAGUS for the people that don't know this, but V stands for validate. And this is where Biocanic comes in. This is where wearable tech comes in. I love being able to see what's going on with my clients. So I've been using my Oura Ring for 7 years. I'm not necessarily pushing it, but I think it's a great tool for a lot of people. Doesn't matter. Pick a wearable device, Whoop, Oura, Ultrahuman, Apple Watch, whatever your choice is, as long as you're not going to become stressed about the data. Data is a great place to know what's going on. And V stands for validate. We truly want to know where you stand and where you want to go. Just like a GPS for me, right? GPS requires two things. It needs to know where you are and where you want to go. But if you don't know where you are, the choices for going to where you want to go are infinite. Mm-hmm. You need to know where you stand. So figure out where you stand. That's where functional lab testing can come in really effectively. I love using things like Bolt score to know what's going on with your breathing. That's the body oxygen level test for those who don't know. It's a really simple test that you can do. It's completely free. Do it every week. Dead easy. I'm a fan of nitric oxide test strips for salivary testing to identify what's going on with nitric oxide levels. Get to know what's really happening within the body currently and where you want to go. And that's where validation really comes in, because we're terrible at guessing what's happening within our body. We're terrible at guessing how many calories we eat. We're terrible at guessing how much sleep we get, how many steps we get. Having data to objectively prove things, is because it's measurable, makes it changeable. So that's where validation comes in. A stands for activate. And activate for me is activate the vagus nerve. Let's get vagus nerve working really effectively. Let's get your vagus nerve working with your breathing, with specific lifestyle practices where you create this feeling of safety. This is creative pursuits, right? For my kids, it's like, Lego. Grab Lego and go and sit and do your Lego, or start painting or coloring, or do something that has a creative pursuit connotation. You tend not to be able to do these creative personal pursuits when you're in a sympathetic, stressed out state. Your body has to shift. And you'll even notice that the breath shifts when you get into these creative pursuit states. Even for some people, it's exercise, right? Because you would think exercise pushes you into a sympathetic state completely. It doesn't, because it's training you to go to sympathetic and then come back to parasympathetic. And it's the regulatory function of going between sympathetic and parasympathetic. That is the key to what nervous system regulation truly lies. So being able to plug into your patient's life some form of vagus nerve activation and regulatory lifestyle practices right off the bat is where the first shift is going to occur, because it's almost like this overarching dome of safety starts to show up, and now the healing can actually occur, because you can't heal. I mentioned this earlier. You cannot heal when you're stuck in a sympathetic state. You need to create that dome of safety in order for your body to enter that healing state. And that's where acetylcholine going to the immune cells, creating this repair mechanism within each of those organs, is where the healing actually occurs. Mm-hmm. Then the G stands for gut-brain immune optimization. And I did that because microbiome matters significantly, brain functionality matters significantly, and the immune system, which is present everywhere, matters significantly. And also, it didn't have mitochondria linked, but that's where I would have loved to go with this, is let's work to optimize mitochondrial function through that gut-brain immune connection. Let's get the right nutrients in. Let's do some, alter your diet. Let's get some of the right supplements in based on the functional lab testing I did and validation in the V piece. Let's figure out where we can get more exercise in, because that's really more for the brain and your immune system than it is for any other system in your body. And let's get those things up and running again, because that's going to be the next step. Then once those things become a little bit more habitual, we focus on U, which stands for unburden. What we want to do in unburden is start to understand some of those traumas, some of those challenges, those stressors that happened in the past, and start to work through those challenges. This is where therapy can be really beneficial. This is where talking to friends, Adlerian psychology, and bringing in CBT and bringing in mindfulness can be of very high value, because it starts to create this safe space where you can take away the meaning from an objective situation. And really where a lot of this psychological stress comes from for a lot of people is an objective situation occurred, but we attached meaning to it. And in that unburdened piece, we start to eliminate that meaning attachment from this objective piece. And that's where we become unburdened from that piece of objective truth that then allows us to separate. And so we can start to feel safer or have what's called closure around that piece. And then S stands for sustain. How do we make this a long-term play for your lifestyle, so it's something that can be there forever? Not only while you're here with me for these 3 to 6 months that I'm working with you, but rather 10, 15, 20 years later, where your longevity is being identified and created. So S is sustain, and this is building tiny habits. This is atomic habits. This is bringing in whatever form of habit change that creates this long-term positive lifestyle play. That's really key for me in making sure that what we're doing and the work that we're putting in is going to be long lasting for my patients. So that Vegas protocol is really how I plug all of this into a clinical case and into individual cases, but that's the overarching framework that I use to bring that into my patient care.
And maybe, Brandon, how does that kind of align with what you do, and how, what are the overlaps and kind of similarities, but maybe with your different perspective on it?
Yeah, first off, Navaz, I think you're the only human on planet Earth that could have done that acronym. So
I'll take it.
No, truly, it was well done. I feel like you managed to like bring in, the 5 R's and like all the holistic foundations, and you made it fit into Vegas. Man,
I will say I had some help from some AI support. So
okay.
It wasn't just me.
I love that so much. No, but I mean, I think that is kind of the basic functional framework that we all practice. It was, when you were talking about your experience with conventional medical doctors of like, okay, the pharmaceuticals and count your calories and run. Whereas if anything in the functional holistic space, we kind of overcomplicate things a little bit. We can get really, really mechanistically technical. And even this makes me think one of the comments in the chat, somebody was asking about, like how do we modulate vagal tone to potentially interrupt like the cell danger response? And something that's kind of striking there to me is I think it can become a little bit problematic when like clients or patients are starting to identify with a mechanism, right? Cell danger response, it's like a theoretical construct to describe cellular behavior when cells are kind of stressed out, or even the construct of allostasis. Like allostasis isn't a diagnosis. It's not a condition that you have forever or should identify with. It's a physiological flux, a neuroendocrine fluctuating process that's dynamically going on. So Navaz, the way I love the way you broke down that framework, for example, this was popping in my head. One of the strongest predictors for suicidality and increased suicidal rates is low socioeconomic status, right? Mm-hmm. And in the functional space, we see all the time people will complain about the cost of functional lab testing, the cost of all the supplements, right? Whereas you just gave people so much free, the breath work and so many of the lifestyle foundations, because I think there's this overarching theme of like what defines or constitutes like safety, in the nervous system. There was that great book, years ago, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, right? Because you think about, one of the things that I do to, regulate my nervous system and boost vagal tone and immune function, my nature walks are perhaps one of the highest things on my, lifestyle list that keep me sane, keep me healthy, keep me happy. Just walking through the woods, hiking, all the different benefits you're getting from the movement, exercise, the pseudocommensals that you're breathing in, the phytoncides, the sunlight, so on and so forth, right? And so you think about like the tranquility, the safety inducing, parasympathetic inducing natural environment that our species evolved in, for hundreds of thousands of years. And okay, maybe occasionally there might be some sort of major perceived threat like a predator or, famine and scarcity of food and nutrition or whatever the case might be. My point being, I think just like primal evolutionary biology, I would think that our species has better allostatic harmony, living in the natural world where parasympathetic is the norm and you might have like a surge of sympathetic here and there. And I just kind of wonder how that gets flipped upside down in today's world of like constant stimulation with, I mean, even the stuff that we look at on the internet, it's highly triggering, the algorithm is designed to trigger your neural networks and seduce you and pull you in. And it's usually the more like neurologically provocative, which are kind of unsafe signals. So I kind of want to exemplify to, further validate your model there, because I think people need a framework, not like a protocol, not a single therapeutic. Yeah. Somebody was asking about like, well, what about like herbs, adaptogens, botanicals to help with improving that sympathetic, parasympathetic sort of shift? And sure, maybe like ashwagandha and, rhodiola or holy basil or whatever sort of like cortisol, HPA modulating adaptogens to help with that. But certainly, let's say like they're not exercising, they're not doing, you know, the breath work and the nutrition and the sunlight and all these other things. I don't think that ashwagandha is going to, you know, cut it by itself. But overall, that framework there and the sustainability piece is key. So I just want to end on emphasizing that, especially with more of a coaching background historically with nutrition and fitness and kind of metabolic medicine, if you will. The sustainability is everything. And I think a lot of times when people tune into functional medicine, you know, it's a protocol, it's a short-term program that dramatically overhauls everything about their life overnight. And it's generally not sustainable. So those micro habits, those atomic habits, building the sustainability, because, you know, the clinical outcome is dictated by day-to-day behavior, which is based on, you know, belief and education, and the consistency is what really wins the day. But no, I love your Vegas framework.
I appreciate that. And I want to make sure that you understand it is a framework. It is not a protocol, exactly like you said, right? We want to have this simple protocol of here's what you need to do and here's how you should do it. But people are trying to build a house without a foundation. And the foundation is all of these free things. Are you breathing correctly? Are you going outside and walking? Are you moving your body effectively? Are you eating foods that are not going to cause problems for you? Are you supporting your microbiome? These are basic things, but the issue is a lot of people don't want to do these basics. They want a quick fix. And we have to realize that if it took you years and years to build to a point where you were abusing your body to the point where it got to this situation, or there were a lot of unexpected challenges that caused your body to become so stressed that it broke down, we need to rebuild those habits. We really need to rebuild that foundation first. And that's where these free practices come in, as 80% of the change that's going to occur comes from these foundational practices. The nature walks are huge. For me, like when I go, Brendan, I see you at like every conference. I'll probably see you in a couple of weeks in New York, right? We're going to see each other at all these conferences. For me, that's work. And then I step out and I go for a walk in Central Park. Or the last time we were in Las Vegas at A4M, my wife and I, we drove to Zion National Park and we went hiking for a few days. And that was the getaway. That was the parasympathetic shift. And where you can get that in, right? Like I'm in Toronto, it's freezing, it's snowing. We go tobogganing with our kids, and that's outdoor time. Yes, it's freezing. Yes, it sucks. And they have to go to the bathroom with all their stuff on and it drives us nuts, but it's still fun. And when you're laughing and having fun and you're outdoors and you're getting that sunlight, you're getting so much benefit from just these basic things that people take for granted. And a lot of what we're doing probably is good for us, but we're not framing it in that way because it's very much a have to, not a get to type of situation. Yes, you have to go outside, but reframe it as I get to go outside. And when you do that and you say, oh, I get to do this, oh my goodness, now I'm framing it in a positive and I'm getting goosebumps because I get to go out in the sun. I get to experience the world differently than from my office where I'm stuck indoors with artificial light and screens all around me. And I don't need to be staring at my screen and I don't need to be seeing what the algorithm is saying to me all the time. Get away from it. And when you get away from it, you shift your state into one where it's positive, it's uplifting, it's exciting. If you get to do something and you reframe it into a get to rather than a have to, it changes everything for you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Also, I want to get to a couple questions. There's kind of two from, and Brendan, you kind of alluded to this too, from TCM practitioner. Do you ever use herbs to help people stay in the parasympathetic state longer / get back into the parasympathetic state? I think it's maybe at that point, essential oils as well, because Jen's been using some of Jody Cohen's products as well now.
Yeah. So
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then as a follow-up from the same person, are there any populations you do not recommend cold plunges for? And then my understanding is most research about the benefits of cold plunges have been done primarily on men.
Yeah, absolutely. So first one on the herb side of things, I like anything that helps support reducing inflammation within the body. I was lucky enough to have Shivani Gupta on my podcast, and the episode came out yesterday. It's the Health Upgrade podcast if you're interested. But she wrote a book called The Inflammation Code, and a huge support for shutting down inflammation. As a TCM practitioner, you would know this, but turmeric is one of my favorites. Absolutely. It's a basic herb, but it's so overlooked. And if you're not producing this anti-inflammatory or inflammatory support that your body might need, for me, that's one that I would absolutely go to. No question about it. Turmeric is high on the list. And then in terms of other supplements that I would plug in to help create that shift to parasympathetic, I'm finding fish oils as a phenomenal kind of basic anti-inflammatory support. And from the fish oils, from the omega-3s specifically, we're seeing this shift into SPMs, specialized pro-resolving mediators. And I've seen in some of my patients just a massive shift into a positive HRV change pretty significantly just with something as simple as SPMs. They are more expensive for sure than taking the omegas, but one of the tools that I use to validate is the omega-3 index, which is a great little validation tool to see what percentage of your red blood cells have omega-3 in them, and you want to get to a point above 8%. Most people are sitting around 4 or 5%. That's a great way to create a shift just with fish oils or supporting with more fish oils or fish in the diet, seafood in the diet. So that would be helpful. And then on the populations that I don't recommend cold plunges for, I don't recommend cold plunge off the bat for the vast majority of people. I don't think people are ready for it all the time. You're absolutely right that most of the research that's been done on cold plunges for men. That said, females do benefit from it sometimes. But if somebody is so stressed already from a psychological standpoint and they think cold plunge and they're like, oh my goodness, I can't do that, it's immediately a red flag for me to be like, we're not going to push that hard. Let's start with something much more basic for you. Let's create safety around what you're also doing. What I'm creating on your individualized protocol through this Vegas framework is things that you find help enable you to feel safe. For me personally, I love the idea of how I feel post cold plunge. It doesn't scare me to get into the cold. And so for me, I love it, but it's not for everybody. And so I'll go and shovel the snow in a t-shirt. Yes, I'm in Toronto and shoveling the snow is a thing, but I'll go do it for 10 minutes and I'll warm my body up. And for me, that's the same idea as cold plunge. It's a temperature therapy, but it doesn't need to happen for everybody. So I'm very cautious about using cold plunge for everybody, but cold shower or cold water on the face is a great way to get started, and it doesn't have any of the negative effects that may be associated with a full body cold immersion as well. So those are my basics, I think. Brendan, any thoughts on that?
Well, I got excited when you said omega-3s because, I'm biased with my background, but omega-3s have always been core, foundational, everybody all the time, year round, 365. That's kind of how I was initially, brought up and indoctrinated. But then over the years, I've seen so much pushback against like omega-3s and the rancidity and the oxidation. And I think that argument's a little overstated. And sure, it's probably better to get the omega-3s from like whole food, cold water fish. I love poke, so I eat a ton of, ahi tuna, poke bowls and stuff. But I will say, like, I spend hours digging through research every day, making all this free social media content and other stuff. And omega-3s come up over and over and over as one of the most well-studied, validated, established, supplements that humans can really take, whether we're talking about like depression or suicidality or cardiometabolic, inflammatory. So, but yes to everything you said. And, I think what came up in my head, this is almost like an antithetical nuance where that, like, how does somebody make themselves feel safe? Like, I think there's a degree of subjectivity, which is where I love the objectivity of the wearables and the HRV, because I think if people are tracking their HRV and tracking their blood biomarkers, maybe like twice a year, but then you can track the HRV like every single day to get that immediate feedback and see, what compilation of lifestyle habits seems to give me a better HRV on average. That's what we're getting for. I think some of the comments I saw earlier had me, worried maybe people thought it was more that on-off switch instead of the sliding switch that we were describing before. And it's our day-to-day lifestyle behaviors and the thoughts and beliefs that we choose to engage with that influence our nervous system health and makes those shifts in our breathing. And are we triggered and we're getting a little bit of sympathetic? So I think the data tracking is so important. I can also see something my practice get a lot of OCD, we get a lot of anxiety, and almost people are so paralyzed. And so Navaz, I'm kind of curious, I have to ask, polyvagal theory. It's like, how can we not mention polyvagal theory in this conversation? So how do you feel like that fits into this?
It fits so well together, and you're absolutely right. We didn't name it, but safety is the idea of creating safety, particularly from a psychological standpoint, is from the polyvagal theory. And so with polyvagal theory, the way that this is simplified down is we've got this ventral vagal state, which is where we want to be most of the time in a theoretical standpoint, that we're in this regulated, able to converse, able to be present, excited to show up, very positive experience. And most people are kind of skirting between that ventral vagal state and one above, which is that sympathetic state. And this is that fight, flight thought process. But for me, we want to go a little bit into sympathetic from time to time. So this is where the best performers are able to regulate their body while still skirting the line of sympathetic state. Okay, so just above ventral vagal is sympathetic. That's the fight or flight, but you can fight with a calm mind and you can teach your body to optimize within there. But when you get to the top of that sympathetic state, there's another level, and that's freeze. And that is what's known as dorsal vagal state. And dorsal vagal state is this freeze component. It's this idea that you're this almost deer in the headlights type of concept. And that concept or that issue is where people get stuck in this paralyzed state that you mentioned, Brendan. Mm-hmm. This is that paralysis comes from there's so much for me to do. I'm overwhelmed by the algorithm. I'm overwhelmed by all of these things that I need to do in order for my body to function well. And everything around me now feels like a threat. And I don't have this capacity to separate objectivity from subjectivity. And everything feels threatening. It feels unsafe. And when you feel unsafe and you're not sure what to do, your physiology shuts down. And that's that freeze state. So we have this, what looks like a vagus nerve state physiologically, but psychologically, you're like, oh my goodness, nothing is functioning. Mm-hmm. I just shut down. And that's the anxiety, the severe OCD, the freeze paralysis state that you're talking about. So polyvagal theory, for those who don't know, was produced by Dr. Stephen Porges, Dr. Deb Dana. There's a bunch of these wonderful psychologists that have put together this entire concept. And what I'm trying to do is let's plug in these polyvagal concepts into a physiological mechanism or a physiological framework. And that's really how I came up with the Vegas protocol.
I'm so glad I asked that question because I was kind of dying with the, like, I've always thought of polyvagal theory as a little bit more of like a psychological construct. Mm-hmm. And then when I see people on social media consuming a lot of that kind of content, and then they're like, well, I'm in the free state, and they're almost like self-diagnosing with this free state. But it's like, well, this is a psychological construct. And so to your point that you just did beautifully is let's weave this into like objective measurable physiology, right? Yes. Because I think that without that translation, things get a little bit ambiguous and skewed, because like with a lot of the people I get that are very paralyzed, free state, overly anxious, paralysis by analysis, consuming way too much free social media content and not doing enough of these not sexy basics as the comments are talking about here, right? But how do we move people out of that? And I think, you know, tracking the HRV is such a powerful tool, because then why don't we start with like a, 10-minute walk outside in the sunshine? Come on, kiddo. Like, let's go experience the world. I don't know. There's something to be said. I think it fits with that free state with the polyvagal theory, which I guess then, Navaz, that question So like a higher HRV would be more like ventral, whereas then what, like a lower HRV would be like the dorsal freeze state, or
yeah,
you
I
know what I
like
mean?
to make sure that it's not as simple as what your HRV dictates which of those states you're in. So we have to look at symptomatic nature paired to it and where your HRV previously may have been. So if you have baseline data, then your HRV has come down from that, then we know that you're in more of that dorsal vagal state, right? Or you're going into that freeze state. So lowest HRV tends to be in a hypersympathetic state. And then you'll have a slight physiological bump up into that dorsal vagal with your HRV, but it's not going to show up symptomatically. You're not going to feel better. You're going to feel frozen, paralyzed, anxious, worried. And that will maintain generally a relatively lower HRV, not low as physiological and psychological sympathetic state will, but it's just mildly elevated. But in an ideal world, your ventral vagal state is optimal vagal tone and optimal autonomic flexibility, the ability to shift easily between the two. And so we want to have variability. What that means, very simply from a physiologic standpoint, is we want to be able to push the accelerator and the brakes as necessary, appropriately. When there's an emergency, push the brakes really effectively and not have burnt out brakes, and push the accelerator when it's time to move, and be able to have those pedals working effectively. And so those two pedals, for me, within the body, hey, there's something's happening. I heard a bang. I got to go check what's going on. I can go do that without an objective, overwhelmed feeling happening within my body. And then, oh, not a big deal. I can come back, sit down, and my heart rate can come back down, and I'm able to push the brakes and get back to the thing that I was doing if I'm in my office or whatever it is. So it's the ability to shift between sympathetic, parasympathetic. That's much more important than simply vagal tone and HRV. We want to have that autonomic flexibility. We want to have nervous system regulation. Vagus nerve is usually that missing piece, though.
Awesome. And we only have a couple minutes left and we didn't even touch on this, but maybe we give the quick run through on vagal stimulation devices, because there's a litany of them out there. I mean, I think I get hit with ads about, every 3 flights or so. So I'd love to just get your quick take on that.
Yeah, I am testing out a bunch and I've got them all around me. So this is a thing that I've become well versed on. There's cervical devices, which are generally shorter stimulation direct to the vagal cervical trunk. Some good research on a few of the devices, some that are a little bit more playing around with it. But the cervical devices generally have reasonably good data in short-term therapeutic timelines. So things like Truvega, things like Hulis, I'm a big fan. Pulsetto, less so, but it has great marketing, so most people are aware of that one. On the auricular side, auricular stimulation should be tragus specifically. It has to be affecting the tragus and the Symbaconcha area of the ear. If you don't know what that means, do your research. Make sure that where the connectivity of that is where the vagus nerve is actually connecting on the ear. So make sure that you're using things like this. So I really like this Yojo auricular device. Had really great effects with that one. There's things like ZenBud, there's Neuropod, Nuvana, all of these things are out there. So those are the auricular stimulators. They're generally great research, but it's a longer treatment time. You're looking for 30 to 45, maybe 60 minutes with those devices. So it's maybe a little bit more difficult to plug into daily life. And then the third form of vagus nerve stimulator is these biofeedback tools, things like Apollo Neuro or Sensate. They're good as vibration tools that almost just remind you to get into a breathing pattern that is necessary. And that is different than direct vagus nerve stimulation. If it's just a reminder that you need to breathe, those are great devices. I'm a fan of let's identify which device works best in your specific case. And that way you're not going to go out and spend $8,000 on different devices all the time. So quick overview, but that should kind of lay the groundwork for making good decision if you are deciding on a stimulator.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, we just barely even scratched the surface on that. We probably could have done another whole hour on that. Just wanted to highlight,
so.
highlight a comment from at Gladys Clark 7334. This webinar has been validating for all that I've been through and what I'm learning from different sources. So amazing work. And before we got on, we had another comment, just really impressed with your presentation at the Hicks Live last fall. Just continue to get great feedback from that presentation. So
I had a great time.
Yeah. Thanks for all your presentation, all your information. This is just really great info that our practitioners, really love. It's an area that's really not as talked about, and so really appreciate all the work that you put into it.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Brendan.
Where can they find out more about you and where to follow you?
Yeah, you showed the book, but I'll just show the two. Activate Your Vagus Nerve was the first one. Upgrade Your Vagus Nerve is the second one. This one is more kind of basics for anybody that's out there. Really great for patients to understand what it's doing. This goes deeper into the vagus nerve stimulation piece of how to make it work more effectively. Follow me on Instagram at Dr. Navaz Habib. Usually one of the Biocanic or Brendan Vermeyer amazing posts will have me tagged in something. So you can just follow from there as well. And then YouTube, podcast, Google me, I'm up there.
Yeah. And if you ever see him in person, he'll give you a personal...
I'll sign it for you, just like that.
Yeah. I was going to say, I have a signed copy.
Awesome. Well, this has been great. Thanks again, Brendan. Thanks, Navaz. Really great chatting with you. And we'll see you at the next event. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. And join us in a month for our next Precision Protocol. I think we're going to be deep diving into multi-omic analysis. So that should be a fun brain crusher. Anyway, thanks, everybody.
Thank
you, guys.